It's about 1985 that you thought about this concept? Or did it go back beyond that for you?
There's two answers to the question, and both are true, I think. As a thing, open space technology, we did it the first in 1985. And so from that point of view, I guess it's, 17 years old. But I think what's become very clear, certainly to me and to lots of other people, is that the approach is certainly as old as the shaman's circle of 15,000 BC. And in many ways, the inspiration for it, which wasn't a long process, but came out of my own experience in West Africa working with tribal groups in Liberia. So it's both, I guess, relatively new, although 17 years is not all that new. I think people probably need to recognize that at this point the beta tests are in. We've never kept any accurate numbers, but I would guess somewhere between 20 and 30,000 open spaces have been done. We have some record of 72 countries being involved, and if you started adding up the numbers of people, we're clearly in the millions. So, you know, it didn't happen yesterday. I mean, it didn't happen, you know, thousands of years ago as open space technology, but I think it did in many ways.
And as you say, the numbers are coming in, it is actually working, it's being adopted.
Well, it's a funny thing about open space. It always seems to work. Work in the sense that, you know, people get together, they get deeply involved in the discussions as long as they really care to. And it's interesting. There's never been a great deal of funding put, or institutional backing or anything else. And really of its own accord, it's spread totally around the world. I mean, at this juncture, I don't think there isn't a continent where it hasn't been done and hasn't been done, I won't say as an everyday phenomena, but quite often. So that, you know, acceptance level, as seen from the point of view of numbers of times that people use it, the number of different sorts of people that use it, et cetera, I guess you'd have to say is pretty high. The other side of it is that it's always amazing to me how groups will, or companies or something will say, you know, I never really heard of that, when in point of fact it's been done right there. And I think part of it is that what happens in open space just contravenes what people think should happen in a meeting, and the productive results are typically so far in excess of what you might anticipate that it just sort of goes off the scale. And so the only way to deal with that is to sort of pretend that it didn't happen.
You were talking this morning about, I was asking the question, I think, about how you get an organisation that's reticent to accept it. And could you tell me a bit about the strategies for adoption, if you like?
Yeah. Well, I think everybody has sort of different approaches to this. I think what I found, and what a lot of people find, is there's no point in forcing anybody to do it. So even if you had the power to do that, it's not worthwhile. But we find that open space works very well in any situation where you've got a real issue of genuine concern that's just so big, so complex, and whatever, that nobody can get their arms around it. And where, you know, some sort of decisive action is required within a reasonable period of time, or even an unreasonable period of time. And for most organizations today, something like that happens just about once a week, if not daily. So that the opportunities are almost endless. And in most cases that I get involved in, I've never tried to persuade anybody to do it. It's always been the case of, we've run out of options. What we need to do has to be done yesterday. Can you think of a way to do it? And we go from there. The core of it is, I think, is the process of self-organization, which, you know, 30 years ago, those words weren't even invented. But I believe the scientific community at this juncture is pretty much at a point of consensus that even though we may lack the details about, exactly what the preconditions are and exactly what it does and how it works, that it occurs, I think is pretty much of a given, whether you're talking to physicists or biologists or whatever. Where there's been real resistance to thinking of self-organization is with so-called human systems. And I think the reason is largely a matter of ego, because for an awful lot of people, their self-worth is defined by, well, this is my organization and I created it, and should it turn out that it actually happened all by itself, this would be rather difficult. But, leave that to one side. I think the case is that the reason you can take 1,500 people and with 15 minutes instruction and less than an hour of further activity, bring them to the point where they were productively engaged in very complex activities, unsupervised by anybody except themselves, and being able to bring all of that to successful and productive conclusion with work groups, with issues accomplished and so forth and so on. There is no other, if you will, scientific theory that I know of that would account for that. Standard theory of organization tells you that to do a meeting like that, you will require at least a year and hundreds of facilitators and et cetera. And yet our experience time and time again, even with extraordinarily complex projects like, redesigning the doors on airplanes for Boeing aircraft, or building a $200 million pavilion, and the stories go on, it happens. And so I guess for lack of a better explanation, it seems to be the one that works at the moment.
To people who are entrenched in sort of current management theory, I guess, control seems to be the buzzword. And in my experience, some of that reason for control is based on fear of failure to meet deadlines, failure to meet expectations above you. And yet this seems to go counterintuitive to that. It's about letting go control and, in fact, handing control over to people at any level in the organisation. So could you just comment on that?
Well, I think there are two ways to comment on that. One, which would be my preferred way, is simply to say that, there's really no necessity to let go of something you never had in the first place. And I think one of the delusions of contemporary management thinking is to think that they were actually in control. They are, to the extent that there is, if you will, a conspiracy of everybody. It's very much like the emperor's clothes. As long as we all think the emperor is naked and for psychological reasons or whatever is necessary to maintain his clothing, he's got clothes on. But, somewhere around is the little kid who says, wait a minute, that dude is buck naked. And so, it really seems to me that whether you're talking about management or whether you're talking about, political figures, there was the notion that they were actually in charge, and there is a great deal of pressure, if you will, or need on the part of the people who are, run by them, to maintain that. Because if somebody isn't in charge, I'm in trouble, or maybe even worse, I'm responsible. But I think there's been a real shift, and it's interesting. 5-6 years ago, I actually knew senior executives who would look you in the eye and say, I am in charge, and mean it. I mean, that's what they meant. And truthfully, I don't know anybody like that today. They will say it. They will say it, to their board of directors, maybe to their employees or whatever, but take them out for a Foster or two, and are you really in charge? I mean, do you actually understand the full complexity of the world that you're living in? I mean, if you're in business, what you do is radically affected by the rise or fall of the US dollar or the Japanese yen or whatever, over which you have absolutely no control. So the vast majority of things that you'd really have to control in order to be in control, everybody knows they aren't. And add to that just the rapidity of change that we all face with, and suddenly you find yourself in a situation where even if you did generally understand what was going on, it suddenly changes in an instant and you're back where you were. So at some level, what we're talking about in open space is not strange. At some level, it's kind of like just relax. There's no problem with giving up control because you didn't have it in the first place. And that would be maybe a little scary, except in the open space experience, you can see that it works out. It doesn't mean you have no role as a leader. There is a role to set direction. There is a role to set parameters. We're in the steel business. We're not in the, I don't know, soap business or whatever it is. But at the end of the day, you are not bright enough. You'll never be bright enough to think of all the details that have to be done. And your role as manager or MD or CEO is going to be that of actually enabling the people you work with or who work for you to fully do what they're fully capable of. And other than that, you'll never get to where you want to get to.
Yeah, so by releasing some of the sort of tenuous control that's supposed to exist, you actually bring out the strengths that are already there in the organisation.
Exactly. You know, and there's some premises in there, and the first time that people do it, it may be a little nervous-making, but the premises are, number one, the people who probably can do the best job of thinking of better ways to do the job are the people who are currently doing it. Nobody has that perspective. And furthermore, I find that most people would really like to do the best job. I mean, nobody wants to go home at the end of the day saying, I really did a terrible job. I mean, that's not what you go home to your wife and kiddies and boast about. So, you know, all this effort we put into ensuring that people do a good job and so forth and so on, I find it just excessive cost. I mean, we have checkers on who check the checkers who check the checkers, and at the end of the day, then we have quality control people on the checkers. I mean, that doesn't make any sense, particularly if you don't have to.
What's your view of performance management as a system? You know, the sort of giving people a score, if you like, or
I don't know. We score everything, right? You get grades in school, so I guess it makes somebody feel better. This is a personal reaction. I can't imagine working under it. I mean, I know when I've done something that's done well, and I'm unhappy when I have done something that is done less than well. And I'm excited when I have the opportunity to find out how to do it better. And I really don't care at the end of the day what kind of a score somebody gives me. I have a son who is sort of a certified techie geek, and I mean, I love him, but that's what he is. And you know, he says, anytime anybody gives me a job I actually understand how to do, I turn it down. And you know, if you create conditions in which the people who are working in your organization have that kind of excitement, and I think it's quite possible to do. What's performance management? I mean, why bother?
Subject close to my heart, but I won't bore you with it right now. You've taken the essence of open space to a much bigger arena, haven't you? You've become interested in the political possibilities, possibilities for solving, not necessarily solving is the wrong word, but exploring conflict around the world. Can you tell me a little bit about that? What led you to make that move?
Yeah. Well, like almost all the rest of my life, I never had a plan and I didn't desire it. I mean, two things happened. Number one, we've known, or happened, or I noticed something, we've known for years that the most incredible sets of people who apparently don't like each other will come together in an open space and get very useful things done. And not only will they actually accomplish useful things, I mean, in requiring teamwork and the like, but they actually seem to like doing it, and at an extraordinary level almost end up liking each other. And this just seems to happen as regular as clockwork. I mean, I'm not saying that there's love and light and all that kind of stuff, but It's not uncommon at all to see outright antagonists give each other a hug at the end of it, and even people who are not used to giving each other hugs, like bankers and things. I mean, I like bankers, but they are a little stiff. So, I mean, that's just been an ongoing experience. And specifically, the application to, if you will, peace, and that's actually the title of a book that I've just finished, Practice of Peace. When I worked in the Middle East, it was, you know, the whole peacemaking process, it seems to me, is so cumbersome that with the best of intentions, you know, it's just not working. And so, you know, the thought was, I don't know that we'll solve the problems of the Middle East or Northern Ireland or everywhere else, but if they're ever going to get solved in the sense not that you get rid of conflict and stuff like that, but that you enable conflict to be creative, and it can be creative. It's not going to be the kind of thing that we can achieve by sort of thinking our way there. I call it peacemaking in pieces. Because it's just too complex, too fast-moving, we can't get our minds around it, and by the time we do, it's changed. And one of the things that happens in open space, or more profoundly in a self-organizing system, is that that system, whether it's a biological or physical or human system, just seems to have chaos, confusion, and conflict for lunch, and instead of sort of expiring, actually not only survives but actually thrives. So the thought was that, and in fact this is what we're doing, that when suddenly you find non-productive conflict, and we certainly have a lot of that, the answer could well be just open some space. Allow the appropriate parties to find their own way. So, you know, it wasn't so much something that was based in theory and we then did it. It was something based in desperation, and we'd run out of some other options. And it's curious, it survived. And I had the privilege of working with 50 Palestinians and Israelis in Rome in April, who were brought together not because this was the peacenik crowd, but precisely because they weren't. I mean, this was, you know, the radical right, the radical left, the Palestinians, the Israelis, whatever. And I would call it a miracle, except I see the miracle happening every time we do open space. By the end of it, we actually had, you know, folks deeply engaged and deeply supportive, and God help me, hugging each other. And, you know, and they weren't skirting her. This was not polite, diplomatic, skirt the issue stuff. I mean, this was head on into the thorniest, heaviest, most agonizing issues of the land, everything from the right of return to everything. So, you know, when I watched that, I mean, did we bring peace to the Middle East? No. Is peace in the Middle East possible? Absolutely.
Yeah. What's the time course on the influence spreading, do you think? I mean, is it possible to happen in 2 years, 10 years?
Well,
the process seems to, what I'm getting at, the process seems to happen really fast. You have an open space and an amazing shift happens within a day. I saw it happen yesterday.
right.
Now these, I guess these are professional open spaces, so maybe you'd expect that to be that fast, but I gather it happens in ordinary groups as well.
No. I mean, the really interesting thing to me is all open spaces are identical, and they're all profoundly different. I mean, what happened in Rome with the 50 Palestinians and Israelis, except for the fact that the stakes were so exorbitantly high, was exactly what always happens. I mean, which on the one hand is the, quote, facilitator for it. I mean, it gives you a certain comfort. I mean, you know, it really looks bad at the moment, but just hang in there and hold that space, and it'll work out. So yeah, it could go very fast, and it is definitely possible, and all those things. The other side of it is, there are people who really want to maintain that control. There are agendas in the Middle East that, for historical, for political reasons, for whatever, that are being worked, which, where peace is not a desirable thing. I mean, for some parties. And that's not just the Israelis, and it's not just the Palestinians. But the truth of the matter is a number of people would be out of their jobs if peace were to break out tomorrow. If you ask about possibility, yes. If you ask about speed of happening, definitely. If you ask about is that a guarantee, by no means.
We've had a lot of soul searching in Australia, as you did a year ago with September 11. We've had Bali and we had shootings which are unusual in this city at Monash University. I'd be interested in your take on terrorism.
Well, this is absolutely outside of any area of expertise I've got. But I mean, you asked the question,
That's okay.
I'll give you the answer.
It's a very personal question.
My sense is, there are people who are just pathological killers. And to the extent that some or all or some portion of the terrorist acts are occasioned by that sort of a person, it's like cancer. It isn't what you really chose to have happen, and your options of response are fairly limited. On the other side of it, the spread of terrorism and the protection of terrorists is directly related to how people feel about themselves and how they're treated in the world. And then you take that one step further. Several hundred years ago, in the case of my country, we had these wonderful things called revolutionaries. And I'm very clear that the British Crown considered them terrorists. And so it's kind of where you're sitting.
Yeah.
And we have exactly the same thing at the moment. It's very interesting that, 2 planes crashed into the Twin Towers, and instantaneously all around the world, everybody's glued to their TV set, and there's kind of this common moment of all humanity, at least the ones that could connect to a TV. And they all sort of sucked in their breath, but when they let their breath out, there was one bunch of folks who were really in anguish and pain and whatever, and there was another bunch of folks, probably just the same number, who were cheering in the streets. And I know it may not be politically correct to say so, for at least in my country as an American, but there are genuine grievances. I mean, and it's very clear to me that if our governments choose to solve or attempt to solve those grievances by repression, the only thing they're doing is delaying the day. In part, terrorism could be just a pathology of human beings, and is that, but I don't think that really explains it. A lot of people at the time of 9/11 were using words like it's mad, it's crazy, they're crazy people. They were neither mad nor crazy. You don't pull off a caper like that with being mad or crazy. I mean, those folks were functioning very, very well. What they did and so forth and so on, that's a different issue.
Yeah, but it was well organized, and it was
well
put together.
Organized and done by committed people who had thought through what they were doing and really believed in what they were doing. And I think that needs to be taken seriously. Well, like cancer, sometimes the only thing you can do is operate, and so you take something like Afghanistan, well, I suspect that probably had to be done.
Yeah.
But that is not a solution. That is at best a stopgap, and the policy of my country is a long-term solution, or policy of the current administration is suicidal.
I mean, one of the ironic twists I perceived being closer to Bali was that in both cases it seemed to me the terrorists presumably wanted to split people apart, to bring people against each other. But I saw a lot of evidence of people getting together in ways that were totally unpredictable.
Sure.
You know?
And my bet is that the psychological impact on Australia is absolutely directly comparable to the same thing in the United States. The most obvious thing that happened in the United States, I don't know that it happened here, was, those Twin Towers came down, and I don't know where they came from, but there was an American flag on every corner. I mean, they were hanging from the overpasses and on the freeways. But we haven't flown flags like that in my lifetime, and I'm 66 years old. I mean, even on a national holiday, the 4th of July, you never saw that much. So, if the intent was to kind of push people apart, it had the opposite effect. But that doesn't, I still think we have a lot of thinking to do about an effective response, and I don't think we thought that one through.
I want to backtrack
Do you
a
smell
bit.
smoke?
Yeah, it's probably something burning on one of these lights.
Okay,
In fact, I can see what it is. One of the barn doors has come down.
okay. Yeah, there it is, burning up. I can see it going.
Hose down any minute.
Yeah.
It's just a peg burning is what it was.
Okay. Sorry about that, but I was just, what?
I didn't run away and knock my camera off.
There you go.
I'm learning.
Yeah.
I was just going to get you to tell me a little bit more about the role of the facilitator in open space, the special role, that it's not a typical facilitator role, but a role that's almost transparent,
Okay. Well, I think the easy take is it's really about doing less and being more. The actual airtime of the, quote, facilitator is 15 minutes up front, and then very quickly turns into a microphone stand if we're using a microphone. And so
Sorry.
as you
We're going again.
observe it, yep, sorry about that.
We'll have to dispense with that, I think. That should be okay. The screen's now glued to the...
Yeah, well, it'll be a permanent one. So you want me to start again?
If you would mind. Yeah, please.
Okay, so thoughts about the role of the facilitator. Facilitator in open space, it's much more about being than doing. And so if you were to walk into an open space and look at, quote, the facilitator, what you'd notice is that he or she talks for maybe 15 minutes, and then that role shifts into being sort of a microphone stand. And from there on out, you don't even see them. I mean, truth of the matter is I go and take a nap, which is not the same as not doing anything or not being really integral or important to the process. The role of facilitator is actually to, if you will, hold everybody's coats while they do what they have to do. And it's not about figuring out the steps of the process. The process that goes on in an open space is so complex and convoluted and constantly changing that even if you had an army of facilitators, you couldn't do it. And more to the point, you really don't need an army of facilitators because by and large, what you're working with are consenting adults, and I have to say that children do just as well, who manage to run their lives and can certainly get themselves to appointments and this and that and the other, and particularly when they care to do it. And so, the driving force in an open space is the passion of the people to perform the tasks that they care to do. It may sound like, what shall I say, a prescription for getting nothing done, but the truth of the matter is you never get something done by people who don't care to do it. Or if you do, it's not going to be done well. So the facilitator really's job is not so much to do anything, but first of all to indicate and then open and then hold open the space in which the people, and only the people, can do what they need to do. At some level, this is an internal thing. One of the things you notice when you facilitate an open space, but it's also true any other part of your life, when things get a little knotty, the temptation is always to try and control it. And the more you try and control it, the likelihood is the worse things get. I mean, you may put out the immediate fire, but that isn't going to solve the problem. And so in order to just literally walk into the middle of particularly a highly conflicted situation and, as we say, hold that space, if you haven't gotten yourself, what shall I say, focused, centered, whatever the word is, it's not going to happen. And so a lot of the work of the facilitator is not about doing anything to or for the folks who are there. It's really about their own personal preparation so that they can be fully present in a way that gives other people the confidence to be who and what they are.
There's obviously a huge range of personality types in any society. It's a silly statement, but it's true. How does flexibility figure in open space?
I am sure that there are some people somewhere who will say, you know, open space doesn't work for me. But the truth of the matter is, I have never been able to identify any personality type, any economic level, any education level, any ethnic group, any gender, I mean, any sort of standard demarcation of human beings that sort of excludes them from open space. And actually, as you think about it, if it's true that what open space is the process of self-organization, and if it also turns out to be true that that has been the fundamental process since the moment of the Big Bang, you know, there's 14.5 billion years experience with this. And there's probably no reason to think that somehow or another Homo sapiens was exempted from the process. So at some level, it's not a strange process. But I've never seen a group, I've never worked with a group where it just didn't work out just fine.
Just tell me about this special one in Australia. What's behind what's happening here now?
Well, 10 years ago, it seemed like a fun idea to get people together. And one of the earmarks of, if you can call it that, the open space community, is that it shares. Personally, I've always said and really believe, you know, open space is free. I mean, it's not a franchise product or anything else, but there is a cost. And the cost is that you share what we learn. And so really from the very beginning, there's been this ongoing sharing. And a lot of people just sort of wander into, if you will, the open space crowd, and they're kind of blown away by it. I mean, typically you get a bunch of consultants or whatever together, and they're hiding their cards or whatever. So it just seemed reasonable to, you know, we were doing it online, we were doing it face-to-face in twosies and threesies, why not do it whoever came? And then, of course, when it comes to creating an event, anybody who ever thought they'd organize a formal event for open space nicks, well, they'd get shot. And so it was obvious the only way to go was to do an open space on open space. And there's never, you know, it's interesting, there's never been a formal organization that doesn't exist. But if you look at what's actually been accomplished over 10 or 15 years, you know, it's like any other professional association. I mean, there's literally thousands of fringe members, there's probably 500 or 600 core members, there's whatever. I mean, and the interesting thing is, never once has there ever been an authoritative group that says, okay, now we're going to do this. I mean, the way open space on open space in Oz occurred was the way they always occurred. Brian said, gee, it kind of fun to do that. And Viv and everybody else said, okay, we're in. And so they issued an invitation and we all came. And, which is not to say that they haven't worked, quite hard to do it, and nor that, and it's obvious that the results are just wonderful.
Yeah.
But all of the stuff that usually happens in terms of years and years of preparation and organization and large volunteer crews and set the agenda, none of that happened.
Yeah.
And there was never an executive decision, if only because there are no executives.
Which is quite extraordinary, because in my experience, you look at any organisation that starts off with a good, clean idea. Take Jesus Christ and religion. Very simple idea. A couple of mates get together by the lake, and then before you know where you are, you've got massive organisations, cities with armies chasing themselves around the world, proving that everyone's free and everyone should love each other and not kill anybody who doesn't do it. And so you have achieved a miracle in this one in a short time, to have an organisation this big and potentially influential without automatically going to a hierarchy. It's incredible.
Yeah, and I do think even take the example of the church. The real power of the church is not so much in its hierarchy. The real power of the church is the way it interacts with the people in the street and grows that way. And in many ways, certainly in my country at the moment, if you think of the church in its Roman Catholic version, but any others, the formal structure actually, for most people, either is invisible or destructive. And so I'm not sure I'm not sure that what's happened with open space is all that different from a lot of other experiences. I think what may be different is that at some level we consciously did what's happened. I mean, there's the discussion going on downstairs about how do you kind of apply the principles of open space. And I was sort of keeping my eye in there to hear if somebody would say, a really good example of what you're talking about is what we already are. There is no executive committee. If I were to proclaim, something, I doubt anybody would. I mean, I guess they'd accord me a reasonable respect. They'd listen to me, but by no means would it go any further than that. And yet, for 10 years, all around the world, from Berlin to Australia to Vancouver in Canada to a variety of other places, annually we've met. And 60 people, half of whom flew, in most cases, halfway around the world. I mean, it may not be the hugest delegation, but by and large, these people are paying for their own way here.
Yeah, they've come about as far as you can go on the planet without
well,
going
that's right.
back.
Yeah, we're going back to that, right. And so, yeah, I think at some level it's remarkable, and at other levels, it's kind of what you'd expect. And why are people here? They care to be here.
Where next for you? You're obviously a person who sets goals for yourself and does interesting things. And goodness knows what.
I always do
Where next?
interesting things, but I've never set a goal for myself, and any one that I ever did, I didn't achieve. I mean, in any specific terms. I mean, I'm not being facetious. I've never had a life plan. I've never had a business plan. What's next for me? It's not about a plan, it's about an intention. I really think that what we collectively have learned about open space can have a major impact on the search for and the achievement of peace in our world. And, it may or may not be, quote, successful. I mean, perhaps humanity this time is about ready to pull down the curtain and say, okay, we're done with this show. But we have no reason to believe that at the moment. And short of that, or some stray asteroid, sort of terminating the experiment for us, we clearly need some more useful and effective ways to handle, destructive conflict. And I profoundly believe, on the basis of our experience, that what we have learned not in open space, but through open space. I mean, and for me, I find it much more interesting as a natural experiment than as a meeting methodology. I mean, the thrill is gone from that one. You take bulletin board and this and that and the other, and everybody's at work. But as a natural experiment on sort of the full potential of human beings to achieve incredible things, intentionally, I think it's quite exciting. And I think we've learned a lot from it. And I think that knowledge can and should be put to work for, sort of the broader, not salvation of mankind, but maybe just that. I mean, it's not at all impossible, and there are a number of gloom and doom folks who are currently doing it. You just simply run out sort of the current storyline, and you end up with a pretty dismal final act. And maybe that's what we're going to do. But I don't believe that we're going to do it because we don't have alternatives. I don't believe we're going to do it because we don't have the resources. If that's what we do, it's because we chose to do just that. And I for one think we have other choices, and I'd like to give people the opportunity of making that choice.